The reading this morning can be found on page 952 of the Church Bibles and also on the inside of your service sheets. It's 952 in the Church Bibles. And it's 1 Corinthians chapter 1 to 17 to chapter 2, verse 5. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since, in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God.
Thanks, Jess, for reading. And let me add my welcome to Boris. It's great to see you. Welcome to some newcomers. Welcome to friends from Germany that I just met. Welcome to Matthew's parents. He's getting married in 3 weeks' time. Be good to pray for them. All sorts of people who are here for the first time or nearly the first time. Welcome. We're in a series in 1 Corinthians. We called it the Messed Up Church because their church really was messed up in all sorts of ways, even more messed up than Grace Church Greenwich, I think I can confidently say. And as we go through the next weeks, we'll find out lots of stuff that is wrong with them. But we're working our way through the letter, and we got to this section, chapter 1:17 to 2 verse 5. And I'd love for you to have it open in front of you. In the Bibles, it's on page 952, and that's even better than having it on the service sheet. There is also on the service sheet, so page 952. And here's the question I want us to think about as we begin. Why can't the gospel, as in the Christian message, be more impressive, persuasive? Why doesn't everybody on the BBC champion it, admire it? Why isn't it celebrated in all the universities? And why, when you get into a debate about the gospel with a friend of yours, do you not always win? Wouldn't you like to win? I think this is maybe a question for you if you're not a Christian, and in which case you're very welcome here. Well, we welcome people every week who are just looking into Christian things. You're welcome. But maybe you're thinking this. You're thinking, look, if Christianity was true, then why don't all the cleverest people in the world think so? Surely there should be a correlation, that the further you advance in your university education, the more likely you are to be a Christian. And if you were to do a survey amongst professors, then they would definitely all be Christians. And they're not, are they? Because we know clever people who don't believe in Jesus. Why is that? Surely if this was true, then it should be more persuasive. Maybe that's one of your questions if you're here as a skeptic. Or maybe you're here as a preacher. This is me. I feel the sort of insecurity about this for exactly this reason. I would like my sermon to be impressive. And I'd like you to think, oh, what a good sermon that was today. And, preachers know this insecurity on Sunday morning. You get up and thinking, is this going to be interesting? And will anyone follow this? And I remember once I was preaching on actually this very passage about 10 years ago. And there's one quite well-known, internationally celebrated preacher. And I was really struggling with this, with my preparation for 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And someone said, oh, this guy, Mr. X from Australia, he just did he nailed it. He did the best ever sermon on 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Anyway, and I was thinking that doesn't really help, but thanks. Anyway, I went up to the pulpit, and this is absolutely true. I looked out into the congregation, and this famous preacher from Australia was there because he was just passing through London as it happened. I thought, oh goodness, this is, and that feeling of, is this going to be impressive? Or maybe you've had that experience just as you've been talking about Jesus to colleagues or neighbors or friends, and you're just scared that you might lose the argument, and you think, if only I could win. Or maybe you did lose the argument. Do you have this experience? You lose an argument about Christianity, then you do a rerun in your head afterwards, and in the rerun, you win. Because you work out the thing that you should have said that would have won the first time. But why is it that God hasn't given us knockdown arguments? Why isn't it that all the professors are on our side? Why isn't it self-evidently the wisest message in the history of the world? That's a problem, isn't it? Well, if you think like that, as I confess that I do sometimes, then this passage is a real shock to us, I think. Because Paul doesn't just say he's come to terms with the gospel not being impressive. He goes further than that, and he says he deliberately chooses that his preaching should not be impressive. And that is a real shock. It's one of the most shocking things, actually, that the New Testament says. Just look at the first verse of our reading, verse 17. Christ did not send me to baptize. There was an argument at the end of last week's passage about people saying, oh, I got baptized by the Apostle Paul. I must be very special. And he says, to be honest, I can't even remember which of you I baptized. It's not really my big concern. So he sort of poo-poos that. It's good that you were baptized, but who cares? Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom. I was sent to preach the gospel, not with words of eloquent wisdom. He says, this wasn't my commissioning. Paul, be a great preacher. In fact, the opposite. Paul, don't be a great preacher. Okay, Jesus, I'll do my best to not be very good. You're thinking, is this really true? Is this what he's saying? Yes, it is. Just look at the bottom paragraph. When I came to you, brothers, I didn't come proclaiming you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided, I chose, it was deliberate, I chose to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, much trembling, and my speech and my message were not implausible words of wisdom. In other words, I could have been, if I'd wanted to be, quite sophisticated. But I chose not to be. I chose to be ordinary. I chose to be scared and weak. Like, why? Because you're thinking, surely, it's one thing to lose an argument, but if you had the ability to absolutely destroy the other person, to choose the favorite verb from those YouTube clips, if you're in one of those debates, what so-and-so destroys so-and-so, or so-and-so annihilates this. It's always in the headline of the YouTube video. If you had the ability to do that, if you had those rhetorical skills at your disposal, and then you choose not to use them so that you come out of the debate looking weak and stupid, like, what is going on? Why would this be a deliberate choice by Paul? Now, we can take this too far, and there's an excellent article online which I recommend by John Piper with the title, Is There Christian Eloquence? And what he means is it Christian at all to ever be eloquent? Because if you take this absolutely to the logical conclusion, Paul is saying, make sure your sermons are as sort of rubbish as possible. And you might think, well, Andrew, thank you for embracing this principle over some years now. But is that really true? You know, should preachers not work at having an interesting, engaging style and good illustrations and a good structure? You know, in which case I'm wasting my time in all the preparation I do, and all of you who send people to the Cornhill training course are wasting your time, because why bother trying to teach people to preach well if the whole point is meant to preach badly? And you can take it to an absolute extreme. And John Piper argues back, and one of his arguments back is, well, the Bible's quite eloquent, as in preachers in the Bible, they're quite good at poetry. I mean, Isaiah, he's quite a good poet. Paul's arguments, they're quite clever arguments. It's not like in practice, he actually never, ever tries to present arguments well. On the contrary, and in the book of Acts, you read about Paul that he persuaded people, and he debated with people, and he preached to people, and all these verbs about persuasion and whatever. It just seems there's something specific about Corinth where he's very careful about that. So that bit in chapter 2, verse 1, when I came to you, brothers, when I came to you, something about you, I avoided that. I didn't come with lofty speech or wisdom. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. What was it about the Corinthians that meant Paul had to be very careful not to be sophisticated? Well, the clue's in that word. The word sophisticated comes from the Greek word sophos, meaning wisdom. And it actually came to describe a whole bunch of people who hung out, it turns out, the archaeologists tell us, in Corinth a lot, called the Sophists. They were a club called We Are the Sophisticated People. We are the wise people. And in order to, it's this very exclusive club, and one of the ways that they would show how sophisticated they were was to speak in a very complicated poetical way. And if any of you have done classics, I'm looking at Guy and Laura, because some of your daughter's doing this. And if you have to learn in classics at A-level, the particular way that they had to speak with a certain number of syllables per line. It's a bit like Shakespeare, but even more complicated. And if you can't do it properly, they look down at you and go, listen to him, he doesn't even speak poetically. And it was this way of sort of fencing off our very exclusive, very impressive, very sophisticated club. And they end up judging everything by whether it matched their own exclusive criteria of how impressed they were by you. And on that criteria, Paul didn't do very well. So in 2 Corinthians, they say about him, in his manner, he's unimpressive, and his words amount to nothing. That was the word on the street about Paul. Paul, I mean, he doesn't even rhyme. It's like that. So and he doesn't want to get into that game in Corinth, because he says the whole thing is built on human pride. It's all about who is cleverest, who is wisest, and he's deliberately avoid getting into that. Now, I think in terms of a battle of wits, Paul is pretty clever, actually. I don't know if you can infer his IQ from his way. Maybe somebody could do that, but it's pretty high. I mean, if he knows the Old Testament scriptures exhaustively, he quotes from all sorts of places and brings them together. He's an expert on the Old Testament. He's brilliant at arguments. It takes Christians a lifetime to understand the writings of the Apostle Paul. There's many PhDs done on the book of Romans, the book of 1 Corinthians. So IQ terms, he's pretty high up, but he won't play this game. And I wanted to draw out in this sermon a whole load of places where Paul uses a "so that" phrase, and I put them all down there on the handout, indented. They're all "so that." In the original Greek, it's the word "hina" usually, but we've got "lest." It's a "so that" phrase. Gospel preachers must not rely on human wisdom, lest or so that the cross of Christ wouldn't be emptied of his power, or so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Isn't that an amazing thought? That somehow, if the preacher was too good, people's confidence might be in the human brilliance of the preacher, and that would then nullify the power of God himself. Amazing thought, isn't it? So Paul says, I was worried about that, so I deliberately avoided it, so that your confidence wouldn't be in the wrong place. Just imagine, you are always the best arguer, and you win every argument. And because you corner your opponent in every argument, they sort of reluctantly become a Christian. Why are they a Christian? They're a Christian because you are a better arguer than them. But their faith in your argument, which is all very well until somebody who's an atheist comes along who's cleverer than you are. And then they have an argument and then they win. And they go, my practice was to back the person who came out of the debate with the most points, and so I'm going to move to him now. There's a danger that if we just celebrate the greatest human thinker, that's where our confidence goes. I remember lots of you heard me use this quote before, but Mark Ashton was the vicar of the church where I was converted at university, and he was a formidable guy himself. He's a very intelligent, and you wouldn't want to cross him in a debate, basically. But I remember him saying he was an atheist at university in Oxford and then became a Christian. But he said, I don't remember ever losing an argument about Christianity as a non-Christian. He said, I always won. He said it's very easy to win an argument if you don't care about truth. You just move the goalposts until you win. The one thing I couldn't understand about these Christians, he said, was why, having lost the argument, they came back the next day maintaining exactly the same position. As an experienced arguer, I knew that was one thing you never did. These Christians would be knocked down again and again and again. He said, and then he said, this is my favorite line. I can actually remember this quote verbatim because that's how much it stuck in my mind. He says, it was precisely because they were so bad at arguing that I realized they must have something other than the desire to win an argument that kept them believing it. Is that perceptive? If it's just a which of us is best contest. And Paul says, I deliberately didn't go for that. I want people to be converted to Jesus by the power of God and by the power of the cross of Christ, not by me, not by my eloquence. Now, I put here application. Do we put too much faith in the best preachers? Because I think we do, and it makes me a bit nervous. So, for example, and I won't mention names because I don't want to dishonor these people who I think are good people, but sometimes we like to name drop and to try to name drop as clever as we can go in the human hierarchy, don't we? So, Professor such and such is a Christian, and he says, and we put our, and well, in that case, I'll trust it if Professor so-and-so says it. And so we start to trust in them. Or even, we have Christian debates with non-Christians, and then people line up behind the Christian, almost like it's a gladiatorial race, and we're backing this guy and you're backing this guy, and let's see which wins in the bout. It's like a fight, and the YouTube things really are like that. And what are you only going to believe the person who wins? Because it's possible to win but be wrong. It's possible to lose but be right. It's just about which one is the better debater. There's a real danger in that. And then what happens when the cleverer person comes along? But it also leads to personality cults. And that's basically what's happened in Corinth. So just before this passage, the end of last week's passage, let me read from verse 11, or verse 10 rather. I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. For it's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there's quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is, each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, Peter, or, and these are the people who are trying to be superior and transcend the whole argument, well, I'm not into any of that. I follow Jesus, which is actually just as smug as all the others. But they got these divisions based on their favorite preachers. And wouldn't this be an awful thing to happen in the church here? Name dropping. I mentioned Mark Ashton, who in his day was quite well known. And I remember going to a Christian conference and they said, oh, where are you at church? And, oh, I'm at St. Andrew the Great in Cambridge. Oh, is that Mark Ashton's church? No, Jesus' church. But it's easy to do that, isn't it? That sort of subtle personality. And then I went to a church that no one had ever heard of when I was at church in York. And I went to a conference. So which church are you at? And I said, oh, I don't think I've heard of that one. And why did I feel a little bit less kind of kosher? Because it's the personality followings. And of course, in the case of Apollos, I mean, he spoke really well. I think he's probably quite intimidating to have as a colleague. Because we're told in the book of Acts, when Apollos came about, let me just read it to you. In Acts chapter 19, verse 24, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man. He'd been instructed in the way of the Lord. He was fervent in spirit. He spake and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus. He was great at public speaking. So, you know, the preaching rater, we deliberately do this at Grace Church. If you look on the term card, you can tell what we're speaking on, but you can't tell who's preaching. That's deliberate. I mean, not that you particularly would have a favorite, but you might do. Certainly, there's some churches where they've had famous preachers. Like I think of Tim Keller in New York. He was famous. People would go to Redeemer in New York just to hear Tim Keller. And sometimes he wouldn't be preaching. And he never said when he was preaching or not. You could look at the term card. You could find out what passage of the Bible it was, but you couldn't find out what preacher it was. And Paul says, I'm really nervous that in Corinth, this culture that's so into championing the sophisticated, the sophists, the we're wiser than you, that you're going to have favorite humans and it's going to detract from the power of God. Don't do that. He says later in verse 26, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. It's kind of a bit of a put down, isn't it? Dear Corinthians, not many of you are very clever, to be honest, to be frank. Not many of you are powerful. Not many of you are of noble birth. Well, that's true of Grace Church Greenwich. A few of you are quite impressive in worldly terms. So I think we've got a couple of senior academics in Grace Church Greenwich. We used to have one British ambassador. We've got a couple of people who are CEOs of companies. Not many, but some. I've noticed myself that I default to talking about those people when I want to tell people that our church is impressive. Do you do that? Oh, there's a professor at our church, you know. So not all of us are stupid. Why do we reach that? It's like if some celebrity becomes a Christian, immediately they're championed. Like so-and-so's a Christian. And Paul says, I'm avoiding that deliberately, lest our confidence is in the wrong place. Look at those so that clauses again. So that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. Wow. Now, you don't want that. So that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And of course, our faith does rest in the power of God, doesn't it? I was telling someone the other day that about some people in our church who've recently come to trust in Jesus. I said, well, that's really encouraging. I said, yeah, it is really encouraging. God makes sure, he ensures, I think it is almost always true, that everyone in Grace Church who's come to faith that I can think of does so in a way that is completely unrelated to our evangelistic deliberate efforts. Not that it's a bad thing to have guest services or, you know, courses, whatever, but it just seems that God decides to always bypass that. And then you go, wow, thank you, Lord, that you did this by your power through the cross. Not because we had our cleverest debater running the course or because it was the best guest preacher visiting that week or so on. So gospel preachers must not rely on human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. You can tell, can't you, what a church celebrates by sometimes what people put in the Google reviews. And by the way, you can do one if you want to. It's a helpful way of, it just puts us up the search engine. I think lots of you are probably here because of Google, so it's worth doing. And most people have said very nice things, so thank you. But what do people say about Grace Church? And sometimes people say it's got good preaching, it's got good Bible teaching. And I think, okay, but that's not the thing I'm most love people to say. I'd love them to say, oh, we know Jesus, or the cross of Jesus is proclaimed here. Yeah, it's good that people work hard at their teaching, and we want to teach the Bible carefully and well, but that's the means to the end, not the end, right? It's to hold up Jesus and his cross. And Jesus and his cross, second point, and really it's the same point, but made even more forcefully. Jesus and his cross is an offense to human wisdom. So see if you can follow the argument. At the beginning and the end of the paragraph, he says, I, in my own preaching, avoided human wisdom because I didn't want to empty the cross of Christ of its power. And then in the middle part of the passage, bookended by that at the beginning and the end, he says, the cross itself is an offense to human wisdom. And again, there's a whole load of so that clauses. And I put them down there on the sheet for you. So that I might shame the wise, or so that to shame the strong, or so that to bring the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God, so that, as it's written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. The cross is an offense to human wisdom. Deliberately, God wanted it to really not make sense to clever people. Just look at verse 18. Because, so follow the argument. Verse 17, I didn't come preaching in a wise way. That's point 1. Lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. That's point 2. Because the word of the cross is folly. That's a very ESV word, isn't it? I'm sorry for our translation. It's a bit old-fashioned sometimes. No one uses the word folly nowadays. Oh, what folly? Says that folly just means stupidness, stupidity. So the word of the cross is stupidity to those who are perishing. But to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Oh, that's unfortunate, you think, that it's so stupid. No, says Paul, not unfortunate, deliberate. So just as Paul deliberately made the choice not to pump up all his Greek rhetoric, so God deliberately made the choice not to save people in a way that intellectuals would find satisfying. See in verse 19, it's written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, says God. The discernment of the discerning, I will thwart. Where is the one who's wise? Where is the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish, made stupid the wisdom of the world? Since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the stupidity of what we preach to save those who believe. God has designed a way of saving the world that looks stupid to people. He didn't have to do it that way. He chose to do it that way. Verse 23, we preach Christ crucified. This is the crux of it. A stumbling block to Jews, literally a scandal to Jews. It really is a scandal, isn't it? If you're Jewish, and this isn't an anti-Semitic point, by the way, because Paul, the writer, is also Jewish, and Jesus, the Messiah, is also Jewish. He's not making a point about Jewish people entirely. Be very ironic, wouldn't it, if he as a Jew was anti-Semitic? No, he's talking about those Jews who've rejected Jesus the Messiah, the Jewish leaders. The Jews, they found the cross a stumbling block, a scandal, because their own scriptures told them, the book of Deuteronomy, that anyone who's hung on a tree is under the curse of God. So if Jesus is hung on a tree, it means God's cursed him. So he can't be the Messiah, can he? He's obviously not the Messiah. God's cursed this man, can't you see? It's just because they knew the Bible, they knew the book of Deuteronomy. Interestingly, this is precisely the point. One of the earliest bits of Christian literature after the Bible is by a guy called Justin Martyr, and he records his evangelistic conversations with his Jewish friend Trypho, and his Jewish friend gets stuck on exactly this point. He says, I can't accept that he's the Messiah because he died. He's cursed on a tree. He can't be cursed if he's the Messiah. And then Justin Martyr explains, no, he wasn't cursed for his own sin. He was cursed for our sin as a substitute. He took on the punishment we deserved. That was key to the argument. But it is a scandal. They couldn't understand it. And then for Greeks, Greeks looked for wisdom in that sort of sophisticated way. It doesn't look very sophisticated at the heart of your religion to have someone being crucified. That's not the height of sophistication. And again, we struggle to understand this because we live in a culture that's been impacted by the gospel so much that a cross now is a symbol of Christian culture. It means it's a church or it's something to do with Christians. But that's not the most obvious resonance for people in the first century. So substitute a cross for a hangman's noose, or an electric chair, or a lethal injection, or a massacre. And there's not such a call for that in jeweler shops, is there? Oh, have you got? I'm looking for a little necklace for Valentine's Day. Hangman's noose? You got any of those? I mean, the jeweler would look at you, and they might even call the police on you. Might be like, "What is wrong with you?" But you buy a cross, and that's typical because our culture's been so impacted by this. But it's not a symbol of sophistication. Lots of you will know about an early piece of anti-Christian graffiti found in Rome, and it's known as the Alexamenos graffiti. You can find it on Google Images, and it's a depiction of a man scratched into a wall, a cave wall, of a man bowing down in front of somebody on a cross, and the person on the cross has got a donkey's head, and the inscription is Alexamenos worships his god. Like, what an idiot. Alexamenos, what a fool. Worshipping somebody who got executed in shame. And so they give Jesus a donkey's head to show how stupid it is. But then the joke's on Alexamenos, actually. Christians, what idiots. And Paul is saying, yeah, God was pleased by that. But that wasn't an unfortunate consequence. Oh dear, some people are going to find this difficult. It was deliberate. It pleased God through the foolishness of what we preach, through the stupidity of what we preach, to save those who believe. God wanted it to be that way. Actually, it is the ultimate cure for sectarianism in the church. It should be. There's all sorts of ways that we could be divided, I think, at Grace Church Greenwich. And actually, one of the things that I am most delighted by, and I thank God for about this church, is how mixed we are. But if I were to imagine some ways in which we could be divided. I mean, obvious ones, male or female. The war of the sexes. Well, I don't think we really have that at Grace Church, but we could have. Or you could go left wing, right wing politically. I guess we've got both. So I don't discuss what I voted for precisely for that reason, because you'll have voted differently to me, some of you. That really divides some communities, doesn't it? Like in America now, very difficult for a Republican and a Democrat to be friends. Such is the division. We could go ethnic divisions or national divisions. Lots of different nationalities, lots of different ethnicities. We could go. Some people here earn a lot of money. Some people don't. Some people here have got higher education. Some of you left school at 16. There's all sorts of ways that we could divide. But Paul says, actually, through the cross, there's only one division that matters. I've put a little table at the bottom of the sheet, and I intended this to be interactive. So you have to think for a minute. Why don't you turn to your neighbour and see if you can fill in this table? Two different opinions about the cross by two different groups of people. That's what it's meant to be. So two different responses to the cross from two different groups of people. See if you can work out. It's basically guess what was in my head when I do this table. Yeah, I think that would be enjoyable. You may not do. So just 30 seconds with your neighbour. You might want to look particularly at verse 23, 24. Okay, let's read back. Between us, we'll know. So, two opinions of the cross. The cross is either, on the one hand, some people think the cross is folly or stupid, yeah, or scandalous, a scandal. Okay, on the one hand, it's stupid. On the other hand, it is Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So I think it's the stupidest thing you've ever heard or the wisest thing you've ever heard. It's pretty big sort of opinion there. And then the two groups of people who think that, the people who think it's stupid are, well, Jews and Greeks, that's basically everybody, all kinds of people, but those who are perishing, those who are dying without forgiveness from God, and they think the cross is stupid, which is a real tragedy, actually, because it's the one thing that would save them, but they think it's stupid. And on the other hand, Christians, those who are being saved, they're the two groups of people in the world. And it should stop sectarianism, shouldn't it? Because in Grace Church Greenwich, there aren't the, well, there are the, I'm just looking out at you now, the Indians and the Germans and the Ugandans and the Nigerians and the Scottish and we've got the New Zealand, the Kiwis. I'm just looking at, as I look at people's faces around the room, there are those. That's not really the division that matters. Or there's the Tories and the Lib Dems and the Labour supporters. That doesn't matter. There's those who trust the word of the cross, for whom it is wisdom and power, and they're being saved. And there's other people who think it's the stupidest thing they've ever heard, and they're perishing. That's the only division that matters at Grace Church Greenwich. It's the only division that matters in Greenwich, actually, in the end. And God has made that division not based on how clever you are or how powerful you are. That's why if you were to do a graph of how much university education somebody had and how likely they were to be a Christian, there wouldn't really be a correlation at all. Or how strong you were and how likely you were to be a Christian. There's not really any correlation. Not many of you are strong. Some of you I can see in the middle of the church. Not many of you are wise. Some of you are. But all of you, if you're trusting in Jesus, are being saved. Now, why does God do it that way as we close? Again, why is this a deliberate choice to do it this way? And the answer is that God really hates boasting. He hates people taking credit themselves, patting themselves on the back for something that his son does, that Jesus does. He doesn't want the preacher to take credit. Oh, what a great preacher the Apostle Paul is, or what great preachers we have at our particular church, or whatever. He's not into that. Not even. I figured out theology correctly. I'm a Christian because I managed to work it out. No, he's not into that. God has done everything he possibly can to exclude human boasting because he hates it. And the church in Corinth, they were quite a proud church, as we're going to see. They're quite full of themselves. And because they're quite full of themselves, they end up with factions. Oh, we're part of the special group that follows Apollos, and he's really good at rhetoric, you know. Oh, are you? Oh, we're with Apostle Paul. He wrote Romans, you know. Oh, really? I follow Jesus. I'm a Christian, you know. These factions, all about patting themselves on the back. And Paul's like, I don't want any of that. God hates that. God's deliberately chosen the weak things of the world to shame the strong, and the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, so that in order, so our final ultimate so that clause, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. He hates boasting. He wants the only thing we can boast in to be in Jesus. I'm going to read together those words that we read together for our congregational reading as we close the sermon. This is what God says. Let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But if anyone's going to boast, let them boast in this, that they understand and know me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. for these are the things I delight in, says the Lord. Or as Paul, I think, takes those same words in 1 Corinthians, and he says our theme verse, Christ Jesus, he became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. And we're going to take a pause to humble ourselves before Jesus, and then we're going to pray together.